Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Nothing like spending a beautiful Saturday morning in Key West talking about eugenics. There's something that's, and I would just say that it feels like a real privilege to be here. I really feel like it's my first time here, and it's one of those places. I mean, you go around the world to different literary seminars, and sometimes you feel like you're sort of in the middle of a funeral. And this seminar has been so vibrant and so rich and so nourishing, and it's very humbling and wonderful to be here. And it's one of those places where you just feel like you're just continually meeting good friends you've known for years, but for the first time. So I feel like I'm among my people. And thank you to Arlo, and thank you to all the staff and the board and all this. It's just wonderful. And now we're in the living room, which I'm a little bit sad about. Well, and of course, there's a podium in the living room. And I'm a little bit sad, to tell you the truth, that we're not in the study still, because I've had this weird fantasy, for very many years, that I always wanted to start a reading with my back to the audience, with an ascot and a pipe, Oh, I didn't hear you come in. Have a seat, So there's that, and then after the intro, and you think, oh, Richard Russo's going to be here, Claire Masuda's going to be here, Rachel Kushner, Gary Steingart. It just reminded me of once when I was on a book tour, and for like 10 cities in a row, my events were the same night that Margaret Atwood was having an event. So it would be me and like 4 or 5 very forlorn, miserable people, and we could hear like thousands of people down the road cheering and be like, Margaret Atwood. But it's okay. I was a drummer in a third-rate rock band for many years, and so it was a little nostalgic because I was sort of like, I spent a good part of my life like being the only thing in between people and the audience and the people they actually had come to see. So anyways. What I'm going to do today is just sort of talk a little bit about how I came to write This Other Eden. I'm a very discursive, digressive person. I'm not a systematic thinker, as they say. One of the things that's actually true, I said this is not just like a bit of shtick, it's that I wrote at least a good 70-75% of This Other Eden on Post-it notes. I'm kind of like a magpie. I just go around and go, ooh, shiny, a nickel, tinsel, and I put things together and put everything into the big pot at the beginning when I'm trying to conjure or invoke a novel. Just, again, with it's become an act of faith that it terrifies me, but I enjoy it too as a writer, which is trusting your imagination and trusting what you just naturally are inclined to. I find that what you love as as an artist and what you love as a person who looks at art and listens to music and reads books and everything is just to trust that and to know and what lays claim to your imagination befalls you. It's not like you go around and say, I'm going to like that, and I'm going to like this. It's almost like a dream, and so to me, it's something kind of mysterious and wonderful, a little bit scary, but I love the process of anticipating next year's novel seminar. It takes me 8 or 10 years to write a novel, and one of the things I love doing is finding how things that don't at first, and maybe sometimes for many years, don't seem like they're connected. How I find that they are connected, So a lot of times I'll have different themes and characters and ideas, and they look like they're all sort of separate subjects, and I don't know how they're going to implicate themselves, but then they prove to be like a stand of aspen trees. Aspen trees are often it's one organism that ends up being connected by the roots, and so I like to discover that. So part of what happened so I'll just describe a little bit how I sort of sifted my way into what became the book. And then what I'll do that for 25 or 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And then what I'd love to do is just open it up for questions and sort of have a, see if we can get a kind of conversation, because as a teacher and as a an author who goes on book tours, there's always this period about 30 minutes in where the little voice inside my head says, "For the love of sweet Jesus, is that you still talking?" So I let some oxygen into the room. So I can say that I had just finished. So I'd written the book Tinkers. It took me forever to write it. It took me forever to get it published. And then I had written and published a second book called Enon, which not many people outside of my mother and my wife have read. And I was contracted for a third book, and a characteristic, it's proved to be a characteristic experience, is that after I've finished a book and I've published it, I'm certain that I have literally nothing left to say for the rest of my life. I'm finished, I'm brain dead, it'll never happen again, And partially because that is, I open the floodgates whenever I write, and I just literally try to put everything I think and feel about the world, about art, about my characters that's in the book, and so I'm pretty much, the tank is empty. But it came time to write again. I've gotten used to it. So one of the ways, kind of just dispositionally in terms of how I work naturally and how I've come to love working, is that I think of the early stages of, again, trying to invoke or conjure a plot instead of characters, is that I'm very improvisational. I use the writing itself, I use language itself in an interrogative way. I use it almost like a dowsing rod. I'm looking around, and using the language to try to hear resonances, hear characters' voices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I never have a plan. I never write an outline. I don't have a compass. I don't know where I'm going, and I like that. This is one of the things that was always interesting to me when I was becoming a writer, is listening to different writers talk about how they write, and thinking, oh, I'll take a little bit of this, I'll take a little bit of that, that sounds good, and finding out how you really are as a writer, but then discovering how you actually do it. My mentor and now longtime dear friend is the novelist and essay writer Marilynne Robinson. And one of the things she told me is that she never revises. She just starts with word one of chapter one, page one, and writes through. And if something goes awry, she just pushes it aside and starts again. And if I had to do that, I'd be fixing your car instead of writing novels, And so I'm much more I'm deliberately inefficient. I throw everything, including the kitchen sink, in, and just have to iterate and reiterate and add things and take things away and collage them and improvise and move things around until I start to find the shape and the form of the book. So I had no idea for a novel. So one of the things that I did is I just took a minor character for whom I had great fondness from the book Enon. I took her, who in Enon she appears as a 90-year-old woman who gives the protagonist a dressing down, which sort of finally sets him straight, but that's another story. And she lives on her family estate, and part of that estate is a huge meadow. And this meadow, it's very simple. This woman whose name is Mrs. Hale in Enon is based on a woman who is a friend of my grandparents. I grew up on the North Shore of Boston, up in a little town called Wenham. So Enon was the original colonial name for Wenham. And that meadow is simply just a meadow that was in my little hometown that, again, it befalls you. You don't choose it. I think about that meadow all the time. I dream about that meadow. It's just this central place, this geographical location that just, I grew up running around in it and sort of, whatever, just knocking around the woods around it. And so I just thought, it would be interesting. It would be to go back to Enon, go back 80 years, and just think about what this 90-year-old woman's childhood was like when she was like 10 years old. And I'm just going to plunk her down in the middle of the meadow. And so I made up a picnic. I just had her with like her aunts and cousins and other family members, and they were just sort of having a picnic, and I knew the novel was not going to be about that, but I just wanted to start writing to just see what would come of it. So as I'm writing about this, this little picnic, knowing, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going to happen with this novel. What I started to do was I started throwing everything in the pot. So when I'm writing, if I like other books, I immediately start throwing my favorite lines from other books into the book. Luckily, though, as a reader and as a teacher, I sort of troll kind of older texts. So it's usually Moses and Shakespeare, and so we don't have copyright problems, But I'm always thinking about these certain literary traditions and how they're connected and how I want to be connected. And when people read, this is one of those, the idea of influence. For me, it's not the anxiety of influence, it's the privilege of influence. So if somebody reads one of my books and says, have you been reading Emily Dickinson? I'm like, you betcha bippy I have, and I want you to know it. Like, that's my she's my auntie, all my aunties and uncles, And I also do that with paintings. I'm a real junkie for paintings, particularly landscape paintings, still lifes, that sort of thing. So an artist that I happened to come across when I was writing about this little picnic out in the meadow was a painter named Charles Ethan Porter, who painted in the late 19th century. He was a black guy. I think he was from Hartford, Connecticut, and his specialty was still lifes and landscapes. So one of the things that I did was, as I was looking through his landscapes, I came upon a really beautiful, huge landscape that he had painted of a big meadow that had just been hayed. It had just been mowed, and the haying had just happened. So then when I went back to my picnic, I was like, let's put some haystacks in there. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'll just plunk Charles Ethan Porter, or a fictionalized version of a painter, off in the far distance. And there he's off painting. And then so the next scene was Mrs. The character is sort of saying, who's that out there painting? Said, I don't know, Dad invited him or whatever. And that painter was just out in the field for 3 or 4 years. So I was like, don't worry, we'll find a place for you. And so this is sort of how I did, just like, welcome, come on in. You don't have to justify your existence here. I'll do that, And if you wander away, you wander away. And so just, kind of conjuring this place, trying to kind of conjure a world, sort of see what comes up, So something that I've just, again, learned to have faith in and not be too freaked out when it happens is I realize that whatever I'm writing towards, or whatever idea I have for a story or whatever, I know that the initial prompts for it are, if everything works out, the final book will be better than anything I could have imagined for it. And that often what happens is the earliest writing proves to be sort of like scaffolding. It's just what you sort of, kind of put up until the real story gets there. And there's a certain point where you just keep writing and writing. And often I'll write for months or weeks, for a couple of weeks, then I'll get 100 pages down and I'll think, that's exactly what this book is not about, and on to the next thing. And you just keep doing it until one day you realize, I think I've stepped over the threshold. I'm at the real story. And a lot of times what you wrote to get you there goes away. It's still baked into the stuff on a cellular level, but it actually gets cut out of the manuscript. So we have all this. So at the same time, I was also reading quite fairly extensively, as one does, about the history of organized labor after the Civil War, and naturally, and one of the things that was interesting was how laborers, like skilled laborers, were often itinerant, and I started thinking about just the United States after the Civil War, and I started thinking about Reconstruction. I started thinking about Jim Crow, and just one day it just occurred to me. I was like, there must have been many, all black or racially integrated communities around the country. And so it was as unsophisticated as going to Google and saying, racially integrated communities in the U.S. after the Civil War, and of course, just page after page after page of of hits, as the kids say, came up, and it was one of those moments where you're like, of course there were, it had never occurred to me. So one of the first couple dozen sort of communities and links that came up was the situation and the story of a place called Malaga Island, which is a small island off the southern coast of Maine, from roughly 1790, early 1790s until 1912, was the site of a racially integrated community, which had been started by a black guy who was, people weren't sure, but he's either a freed or escaped, formerly enslaved, and he was either freed or escaped from the South. And he and his wife, who was a woman from Galway, Ireland, came to the island and started this, what became this community, until in 1912, the state of Maine evicted everybody from the island. So one of the things, and again, as a writer, and I didn't have the idea for the story yet, but what you're doing is you're sort of looking at different things, and you're basically saying, Lord, give me a sign. So one of the reasons why Malaga stuck out from all the others, for me anyways, was because it was set in Maine, and Tinkers was set in Maine. Maine has laid claim to my imagination. I go up there every year. My maternal grandparents were from up there. My grandparents came from a generation that was very, very taciturn and very, very tight-lipped. They both had very impoverished and difficult lives up there, and they wouldn't really talk much about them. It's kind of like what happened in the woods stays in the woods up there. And with, of course, the inevitable consequence that it made wanting to know what happened up there irresistible. So when my grandparents passed away, Tinkers was a way of me just imagining what their lives may have been. So I thought Maine, that kind of checks a box, because the location, the weather, just the palette of the atmosphere, the weather, the geography. I grew up on the North Shore of Boston, so again, I'm used to being near the Atlantic, the Northern Atlantic. So I was like, oh, that's all right there at my fingertips. I know I already have that. I can use that. And then another fact from the eviction of this island was that one of the families was committed as an entire family to a place called the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. You can imagine what delights await, in a place like that. And that just happened to be the same institution that one of the characters in my first novel, Tinkers, to which he was almost committed, which, just as an aside, was, in my family, my great-grandfather had epilepsy, and my great-grandmother tried to have him committed to this place. And so he left the family. He's like, see ya, I'm not going to stick around with that bullshit. So there were those two things. I was like, okay, I'm feeling a little, this is really sort of interesting. And then, again, this is just this weird, quirky personal thing, but I think it might be, other writers can maybe confirm or, but it was set on an island, and there's something about islands. It's just like catnip to me. And because I think about these other traditions, I'm always thinking about, where's Moses in this? Where's Melville? I immediately start thinking of the island. Oh, these people on this island for over, for a century. It's like Noah's Ark. The island could be like Noah's Ark, and the island is almost like Melville's Pequod in Moby Dick, and it is like The Tempest. It's like the island in Shakespeare's The Tempest. So I was already just thinking, oh, that's amazing. And that Noah's Ark, what would it be like to be, Noah's Ark was refuge, it was sanctuary, but what if you couldn't get off the island? What if you were increasingly isolated? So already I was thinking, what was initially your sanctuary and your refuge becomes something like a prison, or a holding pen or something. So I was already, very, very, very sort of, intrigued by this. Basically what happened is that, when the story came up, or, came up on Google, I basically just ended up reading two articles about the island. I don't remember what one of the two was, but the main one was a feature article that was in an old issue of Down East magazine, which is a magazine that's about Maine and New England. And another thing that really, just rang my bell was there were photographs of the people on this island, and it was just astonishing. I'm a junkie for old photographs. Tinkers was actually prompted largely by, I have the trove of my family's old photos. Danny Shapiro was talking about this, like old, like tintypes, daguerreotypes, like my great-great-great-grandparents, and just looking at those people and wondering what their lives were like. So then there were these photographs of the islanders, but they had the range of skin tones from the palest white to the darkest black, and there they all were on this island. They were all integrated. Their families were integrated. The school was integrated, and so I just started thinking about, like, who were you? What was this like? What was it like the day this photograph was taken? And the more I thought about that, I thought, if it's 1905, somebody wasn't just on the island for a date kayaking and started taking, photos with their iPhone, like, it would have been a huge camera. It would have been staged, right? And so I started thinking, who would have been taking these people's pictures, And I started to think about getting from, seeing who's in the picture and going from the view of the photograph to behind the person who's being photographed and looking in who's photographing you. It started to get a little bit unsettling, So I started to think, I think I really have something here, And then, and I don't remember what, like, the subsequent sort of, how I came upon this information subsequently, but not long after that, I discovered that, by awful coincidence, that almost certainly to the month, almost to the week of the eviction of the islanders, which is July 1912, almost to the same week, the first International Congress for Eugenics was being held in London. And I thought, that's it. I was just like, I have to, this is going to be in my brain. Like, it has just laid claim to my brain. So I was just like, I'm on to something here, Things started to connect and cascade and sort of shape, So the first thing I did when I realized that I wanted to write a story that had to do with this is I stopped doing research. Because one of the things that was important to me is, I didn't have, there are historical novels and then there are historical novels. I wanted to write about a community on an island in a place, unnamed place, but in New England, in Maine, this sort of basic plot. But I didn't want to write about the actual people, because I know the historical folks who had lived on the island, because I had no organic connection to that community. I didn't want to, I knew I immediately wanted to run the idea of this set of characters and their circumstances on this island through or implicate them in all of these other, like I said, literary traditions. So I wanted to think about Noah's Ark. I wanted to think about The Tempest. I wanted to think about the Pequod. And I didn't want to do that to people who had been actually real, actual historical people. So I just took some of the impressions from those photographs and that basic plot, and then went and just started trying to find entirely fictionally created characters. One of the reasons is that something that immediately occurred to me was that, there's this local catastrophe, right? But then it was a sort of regional catastrophe, because there are a lot of things that are particularly New England-ish about it. But then it's also a larger phenomenon. It's a national phenomenon. There's the United States, and there is the particular history of the United States was founded on the two main principles of liberty and enslavement, and there's that fault line that runs through the country. And then I just thought, oh, well, this is people being displaced. And so that is not only global, but it is eternal. It has been happening since Adam and Eve got chucked out of Eden, right? And so I wanted to have, I wanted to have a very particular place, but I wanted to be able to open it up to try to get it to make so it resonated with just like a, kind of an essential, universal human experience, So again, but then as a writer, what you do is you say, oh, I went from local to regional to national to universal. But then since I'm a fiction writer, what I did was I had to go back and turn it back around and go completely local and start just trying to find the individual people, the individual characters, the individual lives that would make all of the material work as a novel. One of the things that I've come to believe deeply, or a couple of things I've come to believe deeply about writing, is that my job and my motive for being a writer and for imagining other lives is never, ever, ever, like the greatest violence I think you could ever do to any person or any character is to try to explain them. You can't, so what I often think is, if you're writing about anything that's worth writing a novel about, you begin having already crossed the threshold beyond which anything like explanation is even possible. So I feel like my job is to go in, is to be very quiet and to be very respectful and to be utterly without presumption or assumption about people and just start and just describe things, describe lives, describe what it's like. So it's very experiential, very descriptive rather than explanatory. And also that is a kind of quality control insurance policy almost to preserve the integrity of that. To know something doesn't mean you understand it. Right, and so it also is a way of giving the reader the freedom to bring their own experience into the book and go through it without having to consent to something, to some thesis that I have in order to be able to fully participate in the book. So there's all that, and then sort of back to eugenics. I'm also, I'm a weird, I'm a theology nerd. I teach the Old Testament, but I am utterly, absolutely fascinated with science, and I'm a kind of an armchair. I'm always reading about quantum physics and all this kind of stuff. Physics for poets, it's not. But so that was another thing that seemed to me to be, very, very attractive about this subject, which is that this false dilemma that has been pervasive in popular culture for the recent maybe it goes through the whole, but the false dilemma between religion and science, and that they're at odds, and so the idea that like science is infallible, but of course it's infallible except when it's not, and religious is primitive and superstitious except when it's not. And I think that the way that we set them often in opposition is to all of our woe. And just as an aside, one of the things I was thinking of is that ironically, there was an impromptu speech given by the Vice President of the Confederacy. It's called the Cornerstone speech. It was given outside, like I think the Georgia, state capitol or something during the Confederacy. I can't remember what the Vice President's name was. He was Jefferson Davis' vice president. But his entire argument in favor of slavery was that it was scientifically irrefutable that black people were inferior to white people, and that the only people who thought differently were religious fanatics. It's completely, I was like, oh, history. That's interesting to find that. Anyways, so all of this sort of, cascaded, and I thought, simultaneously, I thought, this is absolutely amazing. Here's the book. And then I was like, given our country's racial climate right now, holy shit, this is too scary. I better run as fast as I can, right? But then, again, it goes back to the idea that, like, to me, I always feel like, why put anything less than everything at stake when you're trying to write something? So if something feels like it's too difficult for me to write, then it's probably the thing that I should be working on. So just to come full circle in a certain way, then when I went back to the people having a picnic, and they looked out and they said, "Who's that guy out painting in the field?" I realized he was one of the people who were from the island. And I was like, how did he get here? How did one of the people from this island get into this meadow in my fictional village of Enon? And then a lot of the rest of the writing of the book was discovering who he was, how he got there, and so forth. So I think that is, kind of in a nutshell, and this idea too of family, and one of the things that, and I want to open it up to questions, but I will go on. I start off by saying, I don't want to talk, and then Jesus. But I just, one of the things that I always love about Noah's Ark is that the flood, the idea of the flood and then people being on a boat, it's a much, much older narrative from Babylonian creation myths. And every other version of that you find in other ancient literatures, the one person who is saved is the king. And the people who are on the boat with him is his court or his servants. So there's something very astonishing about the fact that, like, ancient Israelite, storytellers and thinkers, as they were forming their cosmology and defining themselves against these other prevailing narratives, made the one person who was saved from the flood a mensch. He's like, oh, there's this guy Noah, he's all right, and the people that got on his boat were his family. And that has that one little change in detail has utterly pervasive and profound implications, because if all of the rest of humanity died and those people that walked off of that boat when the waters receded, they were all one family, and we are all descended from them, which means there is no basis for any of us to ever hold anyone else in higher regard or value. We have no basis for that. So there's a great democratic, spiritual democratic impulse in that. And actually, when God, at the beginning of Genesis, names humans, makes humans in his image, or their image, sorry about the pronoun, those old pronouns will get you. But that was a very deliberate choice, because in the God's image was actually a title, a formula, a title that was reserved only for kings. Like the Pharaoh, Tutankhamun, it is the one who is made in the image of Ammon, who is the Egyptian god. So then for the Bible, the Old Testament and Genesis, to say every single one of us is in the image of God means that every one of us are royal, every one of us are priceless, every one of us are beyond measure. Eugenics, of course, is nothing but a degrading attempt to try to quantify and measure people and measure their relative value according to a set of white, male, hetero, whatever, the idea of eugenics. EU means good genes, good genics. What are good genes? What is the metric by which you measure people? And that's just disgraceful. It dehumanizes people just by the very idea. Anybody who's subjected to that. So anyways, then inevitably you end up with it was like the big beach read of 2023, this other Eden. So anyways, that's kind of a little bit about, there's plenty more to come where that came. But if I could, I'd like to open it up to questions if anybody has any. Thank you. My wife will say, "How did it go?" And I'll say, "I have no idea. I went to a fugue state." But I'd love to, if anybody has any.
If you have a question, please stand and wait for the mic to come to you.
Thank you. That was just incredible to hear you talk about the origin of the story. I'd love to hear you talk about the origin of the language, because the way that it reads is so, it's just like this flow, like you just found a way to be among the characters rather than narrating the story. And I'm wondering about that process, because it sounds like you just kind of magically downloaded it, but I'm wondering if it was torture sentence by sentence.
No. The trick is to make it look like it was nothing. But, really, it's like, my wife is just like, go to the garage, go away. Part of it is that, this is just true of any book, but then the particular way in which it was true with this book was that if I made one false move, the whole thing could just go right off the rails. I think one of the reasons I was actually not naive, but one of the reasons I was able to actually just keep writing the book was that, and I will get to the language part, but was that I am on no social media. So I didn't know how scared I should be. I also, there was some editorial headwinds that I ran into trying to get the book published, and people started to kind of intimate that hey, why don't you make all the characters white? Just talk about erasure. And while I was sort of writing this and coming into these difficulties, I would be talking with, close friends, colleagues, former students, or whatever, who, some of whom were black, some of whom were trans, some of whom were Asian, some of whom were gay, and they would say, "Oh, it's interesting that you're running into this problem because those same big-time editors are telling us we can only write about our identities." And I thought, we're not supposed to imagine I thought, that's segregation. I just said, that's just not cool. I just, can't, if this thing is going to burn out as it hits the atmosphere, it's going to burn out by just being, taking the real facts and just dealing with them as difficult as they are. Anyways, so, and that's just to circle back. It's one of the things I, realized very early was that I had to be very careful in how the book was read and how you bring the reader through these people's lives and the material, because there are, and this is, again, it's true with any book, any poem, any story, but whatever the premises that you're working with and the circumstances and the characters you're working with, there end up being a number of predictable ways that if the book goes wrong, it's going to really go wrong. And so I wanted to prevent, among other things, the two main readings that I wanted to prevent or make the book as least vulnerable to as possible, was one, just to be sensationalistic and gratuitous. So if you look at the book is 225 pages long or whatever. The actual eviction and the sort of actual literal violence that happens to the characters only takes about 4 pages. The rest of the book is actually just spent being on the island, with these characters, and just there being family and friends and lovers and frenemies and enemies, and just trying to kind of make their way through. That's what this story is about. It's about these human souls. It's about these people. It's about these families. It's not about the sensation. It's some sort of sensationalistic, gratuitous kind of violence. If the book I felt like there was an inverse proportion. The more I made the book about that, the more it just reenacted the violence that was visited upon the actual people, and it made something other than them the subject of the book, Another reading that I tried to, insure against too was what I did. It was imperative that I didn't want a reader to be able to come away thinking that the subject of the book was actually their own self-righteous indignation on behalf of these victims. This is, this book is not about you, it's about these people, To that end, one of the things I started realizing I was doing is that I devoted the absolute best of the language that I had at my, and tried to become a better and better writer, and more and more sensitive and more precise, more descriptive, not explanatory, not presumptuous. I devoted the best of my language to the characters on the island, and within the narrative, when you're on the island, when the reader's on the island with the characters, that has the most gracious, the most artful, the most beautiful, the most sensitive, the most solicitous language possible. And then the narrative regularly cycles out and off of the island, and you start getting. I would bring in sources like documents from state agencies and articles from the local newspaper, and those were, and then I would the language would degrade there, and the language that was brought to bear on the characters was dehumanizing. And and so I just realized most of the book is just being on the island with those people, and that's another reason why it took so long. Is it takes me forever to get to know my characters, like just in the way that it takes to get to know a real any individual human. That makes sense.
We have time for another question.
Yep.
We have one here.
Hi there. I really enjoyed the book, and I want to ask you a question about one of the characters who is an artist, and I'm wondering if he's based on the same artist that you talked about in Tinkers?
Sort of. So the character, the person who became the painter out in the field, I just ended up, the artist who initially prompted thinking about a painter, it was Charles Ethan Porter, so I named him Ethan. But he ends up being a 15-year-old boy who has an aptitude for art. He's one of several kids on the island who are actually kind of exceptionally gifted at one or another subject or idiom genre. But he, unlike the other exceptional children on the island, can pass for white. And so there is a missionary who comes to this island every summer and teaches the children. There's a school on the island, and he, in the best of intentions that are catastrophic and terrible, he thinks I can maybe save this kid by getting him off the island because nobody will know that he's of mixed heritage. And then I had to have the editor who kind of came and saved me in the book and let me write the book that I wanted to. She had to guide me a little bit because I don't know what writers do this, artists do this. Like, to me, there's nothing, as an artist, there's nothing more interesting than writing about other artists, and my editor would be like, I can hear the readers snoring while you explore art, that sort of thing. But just the idea of him, if you're a painter, just the way that you have to look and how you see, and and the idea of with anybody, like, what are you looking for? What can you see? To what are you blind? And the same thing. What are you listening for? If you're a musician or whatever, to what are you deaf? What can you hear? What do you heed? What do that sort of thing. But that was just really fun because it was just finding out about like old painting instruction books and giving him these paintings to make. And in the end, I ended up being able to. One of the things that ended up being quite fun was that I ended up fast forwarding 100 years from after the eviction of the island to an exhibit commemorating the island, the eviction. And so partly I was able to write part of the book as if you were going through a museum exhibition, and I included the copy that's next to the catalog copy that's next to the paintings. And that was just another way of the reader had been there 100 years ago when these things happened, and then the reader got to see how those things were narrated 100 years later, And there is something ironic and quite awful about the idea about these people who were just considered the lowest of the low, and just they're considered vermin, and like we need to like sterilize the island, and then 100 years later there's like the clay pipe, under the glass with the beautiful light, and it suddenly turned into this fetishized object of like, oh, this can never happen again. If you ever hear anybody say, we can never let this happen again, run from them, it hasn't stopped happening, But yeah, that's just another one of those things of, I'm personally interested in painting and all that sort of stuff, but then you feel, how does that then sort of join in with the main current of the rest of the thematic kind of content of the book?
We have time for one more.
Just a short one. Do you have a picture on the wall?
I don't think it's up. Maybe it'll be up there tomorrow. I sent in a picture of a nest with 4 robins' eggs in it.
We were wondering who that was.
That was me. We good?
Yeah, that's the time.
Okay. Thank you kindly. Much appreciated.